Okay, so it is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner we're looking at. I tried to set in the background a couple films of recent vintage, Master and Commander, and also Pirates of the Caribbean, both of which use the idea of a ghost ship following the crew. And I think they directly plucked it from Pirates from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. Much of Western film is taken from classical literature and from great books like this. And even this will be itself rooted in other texts that are of significance and part of the literary imagination. And when I mention that here, we're going to talk about its reference to Scripture, because there is quite an obvious reference to Scripture at the outset here when it speaks of the wedding guest and those invited to the party, but also the idea of the landscape for much of the poem, which is in the icy South Arctic, and the ice seems to be a devilish landscape, a demonic landscape, which it probably is leaning on Dante's Inferno for that, because from the time of, and some of you read that with me last semester, we looked at Dante. Maybe not in every class, but since the time of Dante's Inferno, described as Inferno, so you think immediately fire, because an inferno in English is a blazing fire, but Dante's Inferno portrays hell as a place of ever shrinking dimensions and ever colder as you descend down further and further into hell. And so thereafter, an icy landscape is associated with hell, which is easier for us to believe in Canada than it is in some places, perhaps. But it has that resonance in literature hereafter, I will tell you. So somebody with a literary imagination writing in the wake of Dante, when they have a snowstorm is not just a snowstorm. It will often have associations of a place where the conditions of life are not exactly amenable to human flourishing, to put it mildly. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I'm not reading, but I used to put on the course, Frankenstein is found up on the ice field where the explorer Walton is to be found, and it is portrayed in ways that suggests a hell. So, and I'm quite convinced that Coleridge himself is aware of this. And it's going to be part of the backdrop here of the Rime in the Ancient Mariner. By the way, this was a text that would have been published alongside Wordsworth in his Lyrical Ballads. We looked at some of Wordsworth's Lyrical Ballads. His friend and co-writer Coleridge wrote a few of them as well, and this is his most famous. And it was republished in subsequent editions like this one from the 1834 edition. Let me say a few things about it. It does not include here in this variation, and maybe I should get a variation. I think maybe I should. In fact, I will. Not just should, but will. A Rime of the Ancient Mariner in which there is a gloss to the text alongside the text. This will have it, I think. Yeah, there it is. So I'll stick with this version. Because the gloss is what I mean by, on the left-hand margin here, there's a little commentary, which you can't ignore and which you will see that comes with the poem. Now, the original version does not have the gloss. This was put in afterwards, and it begs the question of why he would put a commentary on his own poem within the poem. What's the purpose of a commentary? And what's the effect on the audience? Clearly, he intends some effect. You might say it's to explain what's going on in the poem, but as you read the gloss, you'll find that that really doesn't hold much water because it's sometimes nonsensical commentary. Sometimes it adds information, sometimes it's just bizarre. But yes, are you answering the questions, or are you?
Is it similar to the instructions to, or not the instructions, but alongside the play? Like Shakespeare's play, it has the actual script, but then it has on the side, like, you know, actor one comes in and does this.
No, it's not. No, those would be like stage directions. So in a Shakespearean text, there's a very limited. Shakespeare's written. The text for Shakespeare is unusual because what we have as Shakespeare's plays is usually not Shakespeare's own handwriting. There are notes that he gave around to the individual actors, which they brought together afterwards to compile the manuscript. And there are various editions of it, but very rarely is it's in Shakespeare's hand. Here's the whole text. It's put together afterwards, and the directions are very minimal for Shakespeare's plays. Very minimal indeed. But those are the notes that Shakespeare wants to introduce the play. There would probably have been a lot more at the time. But that's how to act the play. Here it's explaining what's going on in the poem, and I cannot think of any precedent where a writer is going to give footnotes to his own work. Because these are, well, they're not footnotes, but they're side notes, because that's what effectively you have. So we have a commentary on the main text, and so he's doing something odd with this. Yes?
Were people misinterpreting his text prior to the insertion of these notes?
Probably, but these notes are not going to clarify the misunderstandings. They're going to create more misunderstandings. He may be making a comment on how commentators miss the point of texts and will give you information that you don't want to know, and may even miss the point themselves. He might be making a comment about commentators. This is a time, by the way, when the historical critical method of reading scripture is becoming very common. And we don't have what we have these days, which is study Bibles. You just have the text. You have the biblical text. But you don't have the commentators. Like, I don't know if you've got study Bibles, but often in the footnotes, they can be quite extensive. You'll read, well, John Calvin said this, and Martin Luther said this, and R.C. Sproul says that, whatever, in the footnotes. And you read the footnotes because you come to the text and you don't understand the text, or you want more information. You go down to the footnotes, you're in a study and say, well, what does the text mean? They say, well, this is what R.C. Sproul says. And I think, okay, but is that the authoritative meaning of the text? Well, R.C. Sproul said it. And I say, well, so? Is R.C. Sproul God? Is this revelation? What's the status of the text underneath the text? You know, even if I don't understand the original text, is the commentator more authoritative than the original text? I think it raises those sorts of issues. Well, that was an attack on R.C. Sproul, by the way, who I think is a pretty good commentator. But those sorts of commentaries put alongside texts often are considered to be more authoritative than the texts themselves. So it's just bringing into the reader's consciousness and awareness of the problems of understanding and reading texts. Because that's what it does, actually. Even a study Bible brings to your attention that reading is not a simple and straightforward thing. Whether the people that write it and add this are intending on helping you to read it, which they most certainly are, they are questioning that the word is not already clear and perspicacious, which is sort of undermining the whole Reformation and the ability to read the Word of God and have the Word of God speak to you without mediation of the church. Now we have the mediation of the church, but the commentators are more contemporary rather than ancient ones, if you see what I mean. But that's got nothing to do with this per se. That's just the gloss, and I got sidetracked by talking about the gloss. Let's leave the gloss to one side, but the gloss is just telling us setting. We have an ancient mariner, we have three gallants, three young men, and they're bidden to a wedding feast, and he stops one of them. So that's the setting. We have the characters, we have the setting. So there are four figures in total, the dramatis personae, and we have the setting. Yes? No, well, there's a question. Which is the text?
The main part, because I feel like when you have like a study Bible, for example, you generally want to get your own understanding of it first.
Right, so you read the introduction.
Yeah.
and the historical context, and which is the text and what is the context, and what does the contextualization do to the text? Sets it in context, yes, but what does that mean? It relativizes it to this place and time in which it was written. I'll answer my own question. It relativizes. It says, here's what it would have been like in this day, and here's what Corinth was like in this day. It was a bustling city of this particular size, and the church was new. And it had these sorts of issues, and so it contextualizes it. But when it does that, it also, to some degree, says its application is limited to those particular conditions and should not be taken to be universal in a sense. That's the effect of it. Not an intended effect, but that is nonetheless the effect. That's what context does. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't know context, but it immediately pulls you into that sort of framework where history and distance and the relative distance of time and culture becomes present to your consciousness, and you receive the Word of God as a word of man. Right? You see the point at least?
Would you say then that if footnote like these type of things will limit also the capacity of the reader to imagine a scenario?
Yes. Yes. You don't have to imagine. You don't have to, and this may be closer to what Coleridge is intending here. This is a work of the imagination. It's Coleridge's imagination. And you want me to explain what is meant by this. And you're reducing it to what you say it is, and now you're excluding that it can be this. And so he's just attentive to the problems of reading. And remember, the public in Coleridge's day is pretty broad and growing. And he's writing in English. And he's drawing to our attention some of the many problems of reading. I brought up the biblical context just because it's more relevant to this audience. They'll understand the issues that are raised there. But that is the problem with introductions, is that introductions to some degree are priming the way you're going to read it before you read it, which is why I say for Bible studies, read the text before you read the critics. And that includes the introduction to the text. Don't read the introduction to the text before you've read the text. Because it's not, they may mean well, but it's not an introduction. It's a stage setting, and the stage setting is relativizing to a particular place and particular time. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be known, it needs to be known. But first, take it as what it says that it is. It's the Word of God, okay, I'm going to read it that way. And then I'll consider the contextual, historical aspects. But don't let me say that the historical, contextual elements are the main issues in reading the text. Because that would suggest that what is true then may be less true now. And I won't accept that. Right? Because then I can say there's something in the text that was true 2,000 years ago, but now it's not true today. Or I don't like what it's saying there. They probably didn't like it back then either, for that matter. But that allows me then, that historicizing context allows me the get out clause of, well, yeah, but that was a very different time and place than now. That's not the intention here. I think it is more what you suggested, that Coleridge has an imagination, a literary work, and there's a tendency which Sparks notes and Cole's notes and all these tend to work on, which is to try and tell you what's it about, the text. And so then you go and you find out somebody explains to you what the text is about. And you never actually read the text, and you don't care what the text actually said, because you're just trying to get the point of the text so you can get marks in the class and get a good grade. Because after all, that's what learning is about, right? Getting good grades. Because then you can get a good job, and then you can look after yourself, and that's what education's for anyway, right? If you don't understand I'm being facetious, you've missed my point. I am ridiculing the whole idea of getting grades as an indication of what the purpose of studying is, of learning. It's not the grades are insignificant, but they are not the purpose of learning. Very hard for some of us to accept, especially if you're good students and get good grades. Because it feels good to get good grades. So, anyway, enough ranting. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, note it's set in a historical context, and the historical context is of a world past. It's also written in very antiquated vocabulary. You'll notice that many of the words are, even in Coleridge's day, this is 19th century, but it's written in language that would be more medieval than it would be his age. And it's harder for us to recognize because everything that period is going to write, the syntax and the vocabulary sometimes sounds a little antiquated, maybe not obsolete, but here it is explicitly so. And so it lends itself towards a mystery, just in the form of expression. But it's like a 7-part work. And let me read some of it. And I'm going to read the whole first part without interruption if I can manage to stop myself from commenting and doing what is going on here when reading it just to give you a sense of what is going on. And then I'll come back and I'll comment. So part 1, it is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of 3. By thy long beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me? The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mayst hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoth he. Hold off, unhand me, grey-beard loon. Eftsoons his hand dropped he. Eftsoons, one of those antiquated words. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone. He cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. The ship was cheered, the harbour cleared, merrily did we drop. Below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. The sun came up upon the left, out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea. Higher and higher every day, till over the mast at noon, the wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon. The bride hath paced into the hall, red as a rose is she, nodding their heads before her goes the merry minstrelsy. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his oar-taking wings and chased us south along. With sloping masts and dipping prow, as who pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe, and forward bends his head. The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward we fled. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. And ice, mast high, came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen. Nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swoon. At length did cross an albatross, through the fog it came. As if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. It ate the food it ne'er had eat, and round it flew. The ice did split with a thunder fit, the helmsman steered us through. And a good south wind sprung up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9, whilst all the night, through fog smoke white, glimmered the white moonshine. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. Thus ends part 1. Who looked at the gloss while I was reading this? Who read the gloss? Really? Only one confesses it. When you say don't pay attention to it, almost immediately you you sort of feel compulsion to read it, and you're adding information to it. It's not. I'm not rebuking you. I expected you to do this, and it's not a sign of anything wrong. It draws your attention, and you're looking for additional information out of it. Nothing expected to it. But what do you notice about I didn't read the gloss, but let me just read through the whole gloss, and because it's brief enough, and note the effect of just reading the gloss then. An ancient mariner meeteth 3 gallants, bidden to a wedding feast, and detaineth one. The wedding guest is spellbound by the eye of the old seafaring man, and constrained to hear his tale. The mariner tells how the ship sailed southward with a good wind and fair weather till it reached the line, the equator. The wedding guest heareth the bridal music, but the mariner continueth his tale. The ship drawn by a storm towards the South Pole, the land of ice and of fearful signs, where no living thing was to be seen. Till a great seabird called the albatross came through the snow fog and was received with great joy and hospitality. And lo, the albatross proveth a bird of good omen, and followeth the ship as it returned northward through fog and floating ice. The ancient mariner inhospitably killeth the pious bird of good omen. That's the summary of part 1. Is it an accurate summary of what's happened? More or less. Yep. Why bother with reading the poem? I just got the Spark Notes version of it, and I read it in 1/10 of the time. Right? So what's happened? There's the blow by blow account here in the gloss. What is lost in reading the gloss? Yes. The beauty, the rhythm, the meter, the telling of the tale, the enchantment of it, the magic to some degree. I don't want to make it sound hokey or concerning. The word gospel in English is an Anglo-Saxon word, a translation of the evangelion in Greek. English translation. Are you doing Greek? Any of you this semester? What does evangelion mean? Do you know?
It means like the good message.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the EU is an adverb or an adjective, but probably an adverb that means actually well in English, but it's good. And angelos, from which we get the angel, a messenger, but a good message or good news. And the messengers are often angels. These are God's messengers. That's what angels do. They deliver the message. And the message is good. But the word gospel in English has different connotations. The word good is ga, right? A good spell. But spell has different connotations in English than just news or information. It means story. A spell is a tale, a story, but it also has this like incantation, a spell. This is a story that has power. It brings the life. It brings the dead to life. The gospel is a translation of the Greek into English, but has slightly different resonances, which they know, but they want to show that there's something about this text that's not just a story, right? And they just happen to have this wonderful word in Anglo-Saxon that has dual connotations to show the supernatural power of this story. It's not just a story. It's a life-giving story. It's magical, lack of it, right? Just like a spell. If you read the Rime of the Ancient Mariner without that sense, then you can just read the gloss. And you've lost the whole point of reading the story as a story. And you've lost some of the mystery of language and some of the beauty of language and the power of language and the reason why people read, which is to get drawn into a world that is enchanted in some ways, right? And Coleridge is aware in the context of the Enlightenment that the world has been very much disenchanted and reduced to material reality, which he thinks is not the sum and substance of human the world that God created. He thinks there's more to it than that. And this is on point here because Coleridge, writing in the Lyrical Ballads, is coming at it from the opposite angle to Wordsworth. And specifically, they say this, that Wordsworth is trying to take the natural and supernaturalize it. We saw that in Tintern Abbey, and we saw that even in the Immortality Ode. Takes the natural landscape and he suggests that there's something supernatural about the natural landscape. It's God's in that. Coleridge does the exact opposite. He's taking a supernatural framework and he's putting it in naturalistic imagery. So when he puts ice and snow and a albatross and so forth, he means something more by that than what's going on. So it's a supernatural tale that's been naturalized rather than a natural tale that's been supernaturalized. That's in, if you're looking for the source of that, Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, chapter 14, he talks about this. You don't need to know that, but that's where I'm a Coleridge specialist, so that's where he writes about this. And what is also evident in this is that there are all sorts of things, like the tale, the summary of the tale in the gloss is very matter-factual, but what it misses as well is any Christian connotations. I see none. But if you have a literary imagination and a biblical imagination, you can't miss it's not an allegory, but it is an allusion with an A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, to another text, which the reader would recognize and is part of the text here. Not the text in the gloss, but the text that lies behind this text, the text that is expecting the reader with an educated imagination to draw into the reading of the text. So it gives a deep text, which is a different way of reading altogether. This is in the gloss, this is the destruction of reading when you reduce it to what's going on. That's just conveying information. Information is not the same thing as learning. If it were, then the internet would be highly educated because it knows more information than I know and could ever know. But it is not educated because it can't prioritize, it can't say what matters, it can't say what's true. It just gives you all the information you could ever want. And it can process it at speeds that we can only dream of. But it has no sense of the importance of anything other than what people are looking for. And then it will rank them in accordance with, that sort of thing. So we'll bring those up and suggest that what is popular is important. Right? That's how word searches work, through an algorithm, and it will even specify it for what's important to you. And what you're searching for is what's going to keep on coming up. Oh, you like this content? I'm going to bring that to your attention. And what it does is it confirms you in your own biases about what's out there, because there's a huge quantity of information out there, and it's tailoring it to what you already are interested in. But what about the stuff that you've never heard of and might be of great interest to you if you were ever to be informed about it? But the internet's not going to bring it to you. Right? So what I'm suggesting here about Coleridge's gloss, which I asked at the outset, why has he done this, is to show how wisdom and virtue and beauty are lost in an age of information and are set alongside. These are just words like any other words. And the text that he writes is the best form of repudiation of that reading practice, because you can see how much is lost, just side-by-side comparison. By the way, if you want to get good exam results, you would just read the gloss. And would you be a better person if you did that? Well, you get better grades, and if you get better grades, then thinking there's this sort of a whole pragmatic chain of, well, then I'd be an A student, then I'd get into grad school, or I'd get into this program, and then I'd get a job, and then, so yes, that would be a better outcome. The one thing you would never have done is thought a day in your life. And you could get good grades. Some people are really good at memorizing. Would you be a better person than when you started reading and started studying? Would you be a better person? Would you have a deeper knowledge of things? I don't think so. Anyway, but it starts off, and I said it ignored the Christian context. What is the Christian context? Well, it is an ancient mariner, and he stopped with one of three. And the context is, think of a gospel account that Jesus speaks of a wedding feast and those invited to a wedding feast. Can you think of one? Well, we'll do a Google search. Kingdom of heaven's like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some servants to tell those who have been invited that I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and fat and cattle have been butchered and everything's ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off. One to his field, another to his business. The rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burnt their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you can find. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed the man there was not wearing wedding clothes. He said, how did you get in here without wedding clothes, my friend? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen. This is a very mysterious text. This is a very difficult text to handle. Like, if you're preaching on it, explain it. Like, this is a challenging text. What's it about? What does it mean? What's going on? You first of all, you have to start saying, well, it's a parable. And he tells us it's like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. Now, Jesus claims to be the Son of God. The king will, in the reader's mind, at any rate, even if though we might reject it, conclude that the king is God. And the son is the one who's going to have a wedding banquet, and we're invited to the wedding feast. So it's a messianic banquet of sorts. And people who are invited who are the expected guests, and the guests don't want to come. And then other people are coming, they don't want to come, and they treat them worse and worse, and in fact they even kill some of the messengers. So then he grabs and says, well, just bring any old person in here. Good or bad, bring them in there. They come in, and they would get brought in, they don't know anything about it, they hear, and they come, and then one of them doesn't have wedding clothes on, and he says, get that guy out of here. Throw him outside, bind him up, throw him outside. Well, what on earth? I'm not going to preach the text. I would love to preach the text, but we're not going to preach the text. It's a mysterious text. It's about being chosen and rejecting this. So these are God's chosen people, the first people. Like, they're the obvious wedding guests. It's probably the Jewish audience, right? And they didn't come. The father, the son's come. He's invited in the wedding feast. They don't want to be here. So go to the Gentiles, bring them in. Among the Gentiles, one of them is really bad and he's not prepared for the wedding feast. He doesn't acknowledge who this figure is. Well, he's got to go. I'm already pushing in the direction. Okay, but how does that fit here? Well, the bridegroom's doors are opened wide. Who's the bridegroom? If you take the text in Matthew 22 as this, well, it will be a clear reference to Christ. Christ, the bridegroom, the church, the bride, the heavenly Jerusalem, if you want. Right? Standard Christ, the bride of Christ. Analogies here. Open wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mayst hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoth he, and the man who has been brought in there, and there are three of them, he only stops one of them. And he can't get away. And he wants to get away, and he can't get away. Why can't he get away? He's spellbound. Is the spell good for him or bad for him? He's not happy about it. He can't choose, but here it seems pretty evil, at least. At least that's how he perceives it. And how does he hold him? He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, listens like a 3-year child. Those who enter the kingdom of heaven are like children, are they not? So here we have a little child, but this is a child that doesn't want to hear. Is he going to be cast out into the darkness then? And he sat on a stone. What sort of stone? Are all stones just stones? If you have a literary imagination, not every stone is a stone. The stone that Jacob rested on in the wilderness was not just a stone. Remember, he put his head on a stone, and then Jacob's ladder came down and so forth. That stone, that Augustine says that stone is Christ. He had his head on the rock, because references to rock, stones. Not all stones are stones. Sometimes they have significance. Well, he sat on a stone. He can't choose but hear, spake on the ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. Now, I'm not saying that this is supposed to be read as an analogous way of reading the Christian story, but the imagery is clearly there. And it's clearly meant to suggest more than an account like we get in the left-hand column. Is it left? Yes, left from your side. In the gloss. He's on a stone, he cannot choose but hear, spake on. And what does the account happen? Well, it's a sea voyage. And the ancient mariner's telling him about a voyage he went on. And what was the voyage? Well, the ship was cheered, the harbor cleared, merrily we did drop below the kirk. What's the kirk? Do you know what the kirk is? What's a kirk? Church. Okay. Scottish. Kirk. The kirk. So they drop below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. Now, what are these connotations? Is this, like, you can say they're going south, right? And because the earth is curved, as you get further and further away, you lose sight of these things. But there are other connotations to going below the kirk, below a hill, and below a light. Yes? It's going into darkness. It's going down into an evil place. It's moving towards evil, from the light to darkness. Light has the connotations of the presence of God. The church is the city on the hill. Right? Scriptural imagery. And he is explicitly alluding to scriptural imagery, which you are supposed to grasp, which you wouldn't get from reading the gloss. So all of the power of the text depends on having a biblical imagination and knowing what certain symbols connote. Light connotes the presence of God. It's part of the gospel. Jesus is the light of the world. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. When John sends his, at the Last Supper, breaks the bread and distributes it in John's gospel, he gives one piece to Judas, and he says, go and do what you set out to do. And Judas leaves the room, and there's just a little phrase right at the end of that, and it says, and it was night. This is not setting. He's not talking about it being nighttime. He's saying that for a time, the darkness is going to cover the light. The light of the world is going to be temporarily brought into darkness. Right? And then on Good Friday, we'll see that being replicated as well. It's a theological statement. When Judas goes out and it was night, it's not setting. Same here. This is not setting. This is a statement about a descent into evil. The sun came up upon the left, out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down in the sea, higher and higher every day. So he gets to noon, and noon he's at the equator. And why does the wedding guest beat his breast? He heard the loud bassoon. The bride is there, red as a rose. He's spellbound, but where is he? He's outside the wedding feast. He's weeping and gnashing his teeth because he has to listen to this stupid old man sitting on a rock, and he can't get to the wedding feast, which connotes the presence of God, and he's excluded from it. He's under demonic control, perhaps, because this man's talking about a descent into evil, and he can't get to the wedding feast, and so he's losing his mind. Red as a rose, she nodding their heads before her goes the merry minstrelsy. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. So the mariner is presented here as a very evil figure, potentially. It's an evil tale that keeps this man from going to the wedding feast to which he was called and wanted to go. Just one of them. So that is the evil, good backdrop for the whole poem, again, ignored in the gloss. So down he goes, and as they go, they see a icy landscape, which, as I suggested to you, since Dante suggests a hellish landscape. So they're going, and this furthers the theme of going down, descending into evil, a land of death. And they hear lions roaring, or they hear roaring that is like lions that cracked and growled, just like Satan, looking like a lamb or a lion waiting for somebody to devour. And at length they come across an albatross. Now when they see the albatross, because there's no life as they go further and further south, as they go down and down and down, there's no life, there's only death and nothing, and suddenly they see an albatross. Now albatross is a big ungainly bird. You ever watch an albatross land? It's pretty hilarious because it does a sort of like a nose plant. It tends to fall over and stuff like that. It's in Disney movies they present it. It's pretty funny. Swoops and soars, but when it comes to land, it crashes. But the albatross is compared to a Christian soul, which is very interesting, because at first they greet it and they're very happy. There's life and seemingly life in the midst of a dead world. But for some reason, which is the pivot point of the whole poem, the mariner decides with his crossbow to shoot the albatross. So, what does the albatross represent? What does the crossbow represent? In Christian, if we're bringing the Christian framework in, which is explicit in the text, that the framework is there. What it exactly means and how to interpret it, that's another matter, but it's clear. Christian soul, crossbow. You're thinking about the cross. You're thinking of a death. And then what happens to the albatross after this? How does it relate to the crew? How does it relate to the ancient mariner? All these things are going to come into play, and the symbolism will vary. It will transform throughout the poem. Yeah, comment or question?
This text here has the second writing of albatross spelled similarly to how Yahweh spelled Lord in the Bible.
What do you mean?
All caps and somewhat italicized.
Ah, yeah.
The second only, though.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately dealing with what's on the internet, and so yeah, right. And I remember those texts very well. Yeah, and that would be closer to Coleridge's original as well, with the capitalization there. Yes.
So is that also to further the reference?
Yes, perhaps. Yes. So the capitalized albatross and the capitalized YHWH, Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever you want. It's the same tetragrammaton. By the way, YHWH is an unpronounceable word. It's 4 consonants. You can't pronounce it. You can't pronounce words without vowels. And that's purposive. It means that you can't say that name. It's an unsayable name. Like you can add the A's and the E's, and you can decide it's Yahweh rather than Jehovah. They threw an O in there and think, oh, that's not how it's supposed to be pronounced. Actually, it's not supposed to be pronounced at all. It's the name. The Jewish people call it the Hashem, the name. But you don't say the name, because to take the Lord's name and enunciate his name is to suggest you can particularize him and reduce him to a name just like any other name. There's something reverent about having a name that can't be named. So when Moses asks God in the burning bush who he is, he just says, I am who I am. Which is a pretty cryptic answer. It's still an answer, but I wasn't asking for that. Yes, but that's the answer you're getting. I think, well, what does that mean? And in Thomas Aquinas, this whole theology pivots on this. It's the being of God is being declared. I am that I am. He's the great I am. Yes?
I heard that Yahweh, the name pronounced without the vowels, is the breath, the sound of your breath. When you breathe in.
Yeah, but you can't breathe with breathing. Even breathing articulates it.
Yeah.
It's not ruach, which means spirit, wind, whatever. It's the sound of your breathing. The sound of your breathing is already vocalized. As soon as it goes through your lungs and out your mouth, you've vocalized it. So you need vowels to do that. That's what vowels do. And the original Hebrew text has no vowels. Those are points that get put in afterwards. I don't know if you knew that about the text, but the Masorite scribes add those afterwards, a little pointing, to make it pronounceable. But this particular one, yeah, again, later writers will put those in there so you can pronounce it, but certainly in Jewish practice, they don't do so for a reason, for the reason of reverence that I suggested. But here you're right, albatross is capitalized, and he probably wants the connotation of there's something divine about this bird, and they've just killed it. So if that's the case, the albatross may well be Christ, because he's killed by the crossbow, killed on the cross, right? Okay, so then this group, this company, which the ancient mariner is a part of, having gone down into a place of evil, kills the bird of good omen, who is a divine type of being, and that's not good. It's not good. Part 2. The sun now rose upon the right. Out of the sea came he, still hid in mist, and on the left went down into the sea. Note that it now goes the other way. They've crossed the tip of South America, and now they're going upwards. And they imagine the sun is going down on the other side. And the good south wind still blew behind, but no sweet bird did follow, nor any day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. And I had done a hellish thing, and it would work 'em woe, for all averred I had killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Ah, wretch, said they, the bird to slay, that made the breeze to blow. Nor dim nor red, like God's own head, the glorious sun uprist. Then all averred I had killed the bird that brought the fog and mist. 'Twas right, said they, such birds to slay that bring the fog and mist. So a very temperamental and superstitious crew this is. Their judgment is not very good, certainly not to be trusted. But they endorse the killing at this point. Yeah, a comment?
Why did those two stanzas have 6 lines?
Very good question. First point, whenever you're studying poetry, is to note that something has happened. So that you get points for that. Even on an essay, observe that something is. So there's a pattern. Poetry is very much pattern. There's a scheme, there's a trope, there's a pattern, and if you can note the pattern, you will note that certain patterns have certain associations. Like an epic, there are certain associations, conventions, patterns. Okay, You note that the pattern's there. Good, first point. Second point, we've deviated from the pattern. Why did he do that? There's a very good question. That's where you make your living as a literary scholar. No, so I'm not answering it. I'm being very academic and I'm pushing it back. That is where you know, because at that point, okay, so he is doing something different. Why is he doing that? But he's clearly drawing something to our attention by deviating from the pattern. And the more patterned it is, the more obvious the breach and the more it makes us think about it. But first, we have to note that there's an order and a pattern. If the whole thing were chaotic from the beginning without any ordering, we would never note anything particularly striking about it. And then we would not be very artistic. The poet would just be rambling, talking, with no purpose to the story, at least in the telling of the story. It would just be like the gloss. So, answer to the question, well, it seems to be talking about a significant event here. And it's also a pivot point. And you can even look at the gloss to consult. Shipmates crowd against the ancient mariner for killing the bird of good luck. But when the fog cleared off, they justify the same and thus make themselves accomplices in the crime. Look at that. Because we can read in the poem that they endorse what he said. But what it further adds the gloss is that they're made accomplices in the crime. Now that seems to go well beyond the text. They're guilty, and he is guilty, and the gloss writer is imputing ideas of guilt, which were not there in the text. So now he's pointing us in a certain direction. And you can't unread what you've read there. Now it has that connotation. Is it right? It's a sort of a theological interpretation, if you will. So I've sort of answered your question, and I sort of haven't. But it is a pivot point in the, and the reason the pivot is that it brings in a moral consideration that pulls the whole crew into a guilty relationship with respect to the albatross, which is associated with God and the killing of God. The whole crew. Yes?
It points back to the other stanza in the first part that has 6 lines.
Which also has 6 lines, yes. So when you read poetry, you start to notice these things, and you ask yourself, why? Assuming that there's a reason for it. Assuming that the internet has copied it out properly and hasn't botched it, and is not making every stanza 4 lines. But it hasn't in this case. But it did not put albatross in capitals, and that's actually a significant omission, I think. Don't trust the internet, by the way, when it comes to text. Although I'm using it for the purpose of the class. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about these 2 stanzas.
Yep.
And the repetition, I think it's really interesting. The last 3 lines on both stanzas. And I think it just emphasizes how much of a crime it was, because it's just alluding to what the bird does, like the significance of the bird, that the bird made the breeze to blow and brought the fog and mist. So I guess as we read on, we'd see more why that's significant, but yeah.
Yeah, but it certainly captures our attention, and he expects it to capture our attention and makes us want to think about that fact. So even if I don't have the answer, which at this point in the reading we don't have the answer, we know that this is a significant passage, and I'm going to put that away in my memory as I continue on to read. So it's not just a narrative, it's a narrative that's made certain emphasis in certain places. And I put the emphasis on the wrong word so that you would note what I was doing there. It's not an emphasis, it's an emphasis, right? When I say it's an emphasis, then you noted that I didn't speak English very well and didn't know how to pronounce the words or whatever. But you noted that I emphasized the emphasis. Right? It deviates from the pattern. Artistic principle, repetition and variation. Repetition, variation. You do the same thing. I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. No, oh, you did something else. Why did you do something else? And now I'm going to go back to the repetition, repetition, repetition. And I might incorporate a little bit of that little deviation, and maybe that it changes the whole trajectory of the poem. Life goes on, life goes on, life goes on, dead. Life goes on, life goes on. Okay, but hold on, there was something that happened there. Rewind that, somebody died there. Oh, yes. And the story carried on, but did the death have any meaning? Well, keep on reading. Well, you may find that the person who died, that gets pulled in because a story writer will bring in those deviations and suggest that they're important and they didn't just happen. Right? And that's giving meaning and purpose to the story. It's how you tell it. Anyway, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. So they've gone round the Cape of Good Hope. Is that it? Or is that South Africa? I think it's South Africa. But anyway, they've gone down and passed into the South Pacific. Down dropped the breeze, the sails dropped down. 'Twas sad as sad could be, and we did speak only to break the silence of the sea. All in a hot and copper sky. The bloody sun at noon, right up above the mast did stand no bigger than the moon. Day after day, day after day, we stuck, nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. If you read Prince Caspian by Lewis, by the way, he refers to this. It's an explicit reference to this passage, by the way. Right? And he's looking at it, and there's something enchanted going on. Lewis is aware of it. Are you aware of it when you read Prince Caspian? Probably not, but you should be. But then you would have had to read the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which he did, and now you have, and now you do get it. It enriches the reading experiences. Famous, famous passage. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. The very deep did rot. O Christ, that ever this should be. Yea, slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea. About in reel and rout the death fires danced at night. The water which like a witch's oils burnt green and blue and white. And some in dreams assured were of the spirit that plagued us so. 9 fathom deep he had followed us from the land of mist and snow. And every tongue through utter drought was withered at the root. We could not speak, no more than if we had been choked with soot. Well a day, what evil looks had I from old and young. Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung, says the Ancient Mariner. Story's moving on. Albatross, they were all complicit in the killing of the bird. They all thought this was a great idea, and yet they're going to pin the blame on the man who did the shooting. Scapegoat. He's got the albatross around his neck. It's a phrase in English to this very day. You have an albatross around your neck. It's a deed that you've done in the past. It's the sin that you bear publicly. Everybody associates you with that act. You're bearing the albatross. If you ever watched the Mission, Robert De Niro, he carries a big bunch of armor, and he's carrying it around to atone for his sin. Because he used to kill. He's a slave trader. He used to enslave people, and very bad man. Came to faith, wanted to do penance for his previous acts, and he carried his armor around behind him, and then one day it got cut off him by the priest, and it fell down. Anyway. Symptom of guilt, symptom of the weight of sin that crushes him, that they're attributing to him alone and exonerating themselves of it in the practice. Okay, but now all sorts of weird things go on in the gloss. I've already read thus far. The fair breeze continues. The ship enters the Pacific, sails northward till it reaches the line, the equator. And what do we get? No wind. And it's dead. And if you watch Master and Commander, that passage is there as well. No movement. It's dead. And the water, which is all around you, it's torturous. You can't drink because it's got salt in it, and it will kill you even more quickly than your thirst will. You have to find a way of removing the salt from it. And they have no means in the 19th century. They don't know how to do it. So this is a problem. You've got to bring big barrels of fresh water on ship. Otherwise you will die of thirst in the middle of an ocean. Can you imagine it? And so it's a form of death in which you have water everywhere, and yet you can't drink it. It's like Dante's Inferno. You're being tormented with something that is in accordance with your sins. It's contrapasso. It's your suffering in accordance with the deeds that you've done. And supernatural beings come out there, and we're acquainted with this. And here we're given an extraordinary amount of information. A spirit had followed them, one of the invisible inhabitants of this planet, neither departed souls nor angels, concerning whom the learned Jew, Josephus, and the Platonic Constantinopolitan, I can't speak right now, Michael Celis might be consulted. They are very numerous, and there is no climate or element without one or more. The shipmates, in their sore distress, would fain throw the whole guilt on the ancient mariner, in sign whereof they hang the dead seabird round his neck. Okay, so some of it is stating the blindingly obvious, the little bit at the end. The other is giving all sorts of scholarly evidence about the nature of these beings. Does it contribute to the story at all? Not really. Not really. At this point, Coleridge is starting to make fun of commentators and what they do. And speaking to a community of readers about the challenges of reading, which they can do now, and to think about this a little bit. Anyway, I'm not going to get through the whole poem, but I have a little bit of time here. Part 3. There passed a weary time, each throat was parched, and glazed each eye. A weary time, a weary time. How glazed each weary eye. Note that it's 6 lines. When looking westward, I beheld a something in the sky. It's looking westward. What's the connotation of west and east? What comes from the west? Yeah.
Sunsets.
Yeah, the sun and the sun rising and setting, there's that. But I think he means more than that. Sure.
In the Bible, the West always represents like bad things or
Good. Why?
I'm not sure why.
Shelley writes the Ode to the West Wind. It's the wind of death in this same time frame. Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden. Where do they go? Which direction do they go? They go east. Is that a blessing or is it a curse? Yes and no. Sure. Is God not with them when they go? They're driven out of the Garden of Eden, for sure. But they can't stay in the garden. To stay in the garden is to die. God's holy, they can't live there. Lots of associations with East and West.
Actually, I was reading one different translation that NIV recently, and that translation says they were tossed out, not walked out.
Yeah, they're and Milton has them, the angels are like grabbing them, and they don't want to go, and they're like, out you go. Like the wedding guests, bound and chucked out and so forth. Yeah, I'm not quite sure that it goes that far, but they're compelled out. They cannot stay. Is the compulsion out for their blessing or as a sign of judgment? Well, it's a bit of both. It's a suggestion that God can't tolerate them, but also they can't tolerate him. If they stay there, they're going to die, because he's holy and they're not, and his holiness will destroy them. So it's compassion. He clothes them in the dead skins of an animal that's been sacrificed for their sake. They had skins or leaves, they cover themselves. He gives them animal skins to cover them. An animal has been killed for them. A sacrifice has been made. And that will clothe them in their guilt. They are covered by the righteousness of God. And so forth. There are all sorts of implications you can get out of that one little text and very sparse details. Yeah, but the righteousness of Christ is talked about being clothed in his righteousness and so forth, right? That there's all sorts of stuff going on in the text that you must not miss in your easy reading. Oh yeah, well they wear clothes, they were naked before, now they got clothes. Okay, they got better clothes. Yeah. No, there's more going on there in the text. A death has happened, the animal died. And it will cover up their guilt. They won't be ashamed. It's not because they're cold. It didn't get suddenly colder in the Garden of Eden, I don't think. That's not it. There's more. Anyway, but yes, something of that, for sure. He beheld something in the sky. And now he beholdeth the sign in the element far off. This is a useless note, but yes.
Is there something like significant in like it seems like he has the language of the glossary is like a little more like archaic than even in the poem. Like is he making fun of it?
Well, it's a little bit back and forth. Like in an ancient drama, the chorus that speaks as part of the drama is a commentary on what's going on around it, and it represents the people.
Right.
And the people are, despite Hegel's claim that the vox populi is the vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, that's not what the Greeks thought. They thought the voice of the people is the mob, and they're stupid, and you should not trust the people because their judgment is very poor. And we've already seen that in the commentary. This is the learned commentary that actually is sort of obtuse. And even if it uses the language of antiquated language, it doesn't mean it's any closer to wisdom. I don't think the commentary is never wise here.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Is like, is he trying to make fun of him?
Maybe.
Because he says like behold it in the element, and like uses ETH a lot, versus I don't think it's used quite as much in the poem.
Like pubs use a ye old whatever tavern, yeah. Yeah, probably. He might be. And at first, at any rate, so I don't know, but note it and well done. At first it seemed a little speck, and then it seemed a mist. It moved and took at last a certain shape I wist. A speck, a mist, a shape I wist. And still it neared and neared, as it dodged a water sprite. It plunged and tacked and veered, with throats unslaked, with black lips baked. We could not laugh nor wail. Through utter drought, all dumb we stood. I bit my arm, I sucked the blood, and cried, a sail, a sail. With throats unslaked, how many lines are these? 5. With throats unslaked, with black lips baked, agape they heard me call, gramercy! They for joy did grin, and all at once their breath drew in, as they were drinking all. I see, I cried, she tacks no more, hither to work us weal. Without a breeze, without a tide, she steadies with upright keel. How is this possible? If you're a ship without a breeze, you're sort of... And how is it possible that she moves with no wind behind it? It's like the Johnny Depp movie, like picking up from this, right? 6 lines. The western wave was all aflame. The day was well nigh done. Almost upon the western wave rested the broad bright sun, when that strange shape drove suddenly betwixt us and the sun. And straight the sun was flecked with bars. Heaven's mother send us grace, as if through a dungeon grate he peered with broad and burning face. Alas, thought I, and my heart beat loud, how fast she nears and nears. Are those her sails that glance in the sun like restless gossameres? You know what a gossamer is? The little feathers under a goose's feathers, the little feathers under the feathers, down. In a down jacket, that's gossamer. The light, airy, little bitty feathers. That's what a gossamer is, from a goose. Are those her ribs through which the sun did peer as through a grate? And is that woman all her crew? Is that a death? And are there 2? Is death that woman's mate? Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare life and death was she, who thicks men's blood with cold. So now you've got 2 figures that seem to echo sin and death from Milton's Paradise Lost. A little different here, but comment.
He's using the same font now for death.
Yep.
Life and death.
Yep.
What's the significance of that?
These are supernatural figures.
For evil.
Yes.
And in the Bible, it's never, the only one that ever gets that font is the Lord.
Ever. That's correct.
And Yahweh at that.
Right. Well, so who puts the font in?
Scribes.
Yes. And the scribe put this font in. That's right.
Or is it that
It's a tale where it's unclear where good and evil are. I think when Coleridge writes this, he is a Unitarian, and I think that he is a panentheist, and he thinks that there's no radical distinction between good and evil. Depends on which side you stand, but a cancer will kill you. Is it right to kill a cancer? Killing's wrong. Is it wrong to kill cancer? No. Why? Killing's killing. Death is death, love is love, whatever. There's no, the good, evil things, it depends what perspective you're looking at it from. So that might be the reason here. It's evoking a supernatural connotations, but it's not and he uses Christian associations, but is it a Christian message? I'm not so sure. You'll get commentators suggesting that he was a good Christian boy writing this. I'm not so sure that it's quite as simple and straightforward as that at this stage. I think he becomes a Christian later, by the way. But that's later. This is written in 1798. And he was brought up a Unitarian. And Unitarians will deny the transcendence of God, among other things. They'll say that Jesus was a good man and a good worker, and he did good things and so forth, but they're not going to believe in God. If God it's a supreme power, but they're going to deny the Trinity, which is an obscure doctrine. Nonsense. Can't prove the Trinity. The word Trinity is not in the Bible. Anyway, we have these horrible creatures. There's death and the nightmare, life and death. And she is with red lips, free looks, locks, is a lot like the adulterous woman in Scripture. Naked Hulk alongside came, and the twain were casting dice. The game is won, is done, I've won, quoth she, and whistles thrice. The sun's rim dips, the stars rush out. At one stride comes the dark, with far heard whisper o'er the sea, off shot the spectre dark. And now look at how many lines. We listened and looked sideways up. Fear at my heart, as at a cup, my lifeblood seemed to sip. The stars were dim and thick the night. The steersman's face by his lamp gleamed white. From the sails the dew did drip, till clomb above the eastern bar the horned moon with one bright star within the nether tip. One after one by the star-dogged moon, too quick for groan or sigh, each turned his face with a ghastly pang and cursed me with his eye. 40 times 50 living men, and I heard nor sigh nor groan with heavy thump. A lifeless lump they dropped down one by one. The souls did from their bodies fly, they fled to bliss or woe, and every soul it passed me by like the whiz of my crossbow. Okay, so now the story's progressing. The crew has had death and life and death playing dice for their souls, and these men have all died. They've lost, or life and death has won. All of their souls have been taken and compared to the crossbow. A guilt offering. They're guilty. They've been judged, but he's still there. And at this point, then we get the interpolation. I fear thee, ancient mariner, I fear thy skinny hand, and thou art long and lank and brown as is the ribbed sea sand. I fear thee and thy glittering eye, and thy skinny hand so brown. Fear not, thou wedding guest, this body dropped not down. So it's not somebody who is stopping him to take his soul. That's not what the story is. But at this point we get the audience, the interplay between reader, audience, interactions of the text all over the place. It requires us to be rather nimble in our reading. At any rate, he goes on, and what the problem here for the ancient mariner, I'm going to skip over this a bit, is the ancient mariner looks around him and sees, tries to pray, cannot pray. He curses 1,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I, and he hates the world. Tries to pray, he can't pray. I looked to heaven, tried to pray, but or ever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came and made my heart as dry as dust. Closed my lids and kept them closed. He's cursed by the look of the men who died before him. He feels guilt, and he can't bring himself to pray. But eventually, he sees water snakes. He saw all these creatures that he despised. Water snakes are there. And at that point, "O happy living things," he utters, "no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. Sure, my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them unaware." The self-same moment, I could pray. And from my neck, so free, the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. Okay, pivot point in the story, because now the albatross is done. He's atoned for. And where did the atonement come from? Where did the life come into him that gave him the capacity to pray? It didn't come from within him. He blessed them unaware. A spring of love gushed. He's oblivious to it. There's a spiritual movement here that first affixed him, the wedding guest, to hear the mariner, and now the mariner is brought about through a spiritual movement that is not his own. He's been moved by a spirit outside of himself. He's been brought to act. This is, again, a rather Calvinist way of telling a story about how people come to faith. They're called. They're brought. Not of their own accord, not of their own merit, not of anything. They are predestined, if you will. They are chosen. Now, this is a secular retelling of it. It's setting it in quasi-Christian terms, but you can see that he's playing with this in this particular story. Now, there are 3 more parts that I have not read. He'll go back to the kirk and the lighthouse and so forth, and go back and tell his tale again, and keep on having to tell it as if he were compelled by the truth of the account that he has been given. In the same way, those who've heard the gospel, have come to faith, are constrained to preach the gospel. They cannot help but do it. They want to share the good news. It's a correspondence to that, and it's written in rather different terms. But he is playing with that idea in this poem, most certainly. Any final comments or questions? Because I realize I've run out of time. That's why I'm wrapping up here. How do you like the poem? I think it's just really interesting. It emphasizes many things that I want you to understand in reading literature, and that is there's a certain type of reading that only comes from reflection. Everybody who comes here can read at one level, and I hope it's not the left-hand gloss level. And going to the internet for information is not going to help you with the sort of reading that you want. You want to read in a literary way, in a thoughtful way, in a deep, rich, theologically informed way. And the texts that we will read will help you to do that, because they are being written in that way, and you need to pick up those associations. That's the way the Bible itself is written, by the way. There's echoes of previous stories, and there's an interplay between the texts that goes on. Anyway, done for today. Thank you.